Hey everyone, Pastor Tim here, and we are in the first stretch of reading Fresh Wind, Fresh Fire together. So I'm just going to offer you a couple thoughts. First thing is just a couple details is that if you haven't gotten your book and you've ordered one, you let Leanne know you can pick it up on Sunday in Kittery. That we're hoping that they're in by then. If you want to just order your own, obviously you're welcome to do so. This is the cover of the one we're using. It does say updated and expanded, so it'll be slightly different than some of the original copies of the book. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we said 5 pages a day, but when you open it up to the first page, chapter 1, it starts on page 11. So just to stay consistent, June 1st was the first day, so we're on June 3rd. So by the end of today, we'll be 15 pages in. So I'm basically going to talk about the first 15, 20-ish pages, and then next time, I'll kind of continue on. So even though it starts on page 11, we're just doing up to today, basically the first 15 pages. So couple thoughts. The first thing is that I have been to, sounds like I'm bragging, not like I'm bragging, I'm just stating the facts. I've been to a couple prayer gatherings at Brooklyn Tabernacle, maybe 3 or 4 from summer trips. I led mission trips down there, and it's a really powerful experience. It is facilitated from the front, from the pastor, from Jim Cymbala or one of the other pastors. A lot of worship music and praise, and it's really just, you get together and individually and sometimes in small groups, you just lift your heart up to God. It's a beautiful thing. So it's not over organized, but it's not chaotic. They do a nice mix of letting people engage as they feel so led. So I love the fact that he starts out and just talks about the idea that he didn't know what he was doing and he was trying to figure out as he went along. So I love his humility. On page 14, I read this note. It says, some years earlier, down toward the bottom of the page, my mother-in-law had met with another woman who was interceding for God to establish a congregation in downtown Brooklyn that could touch people for his glory. I just think that's interesting because there are people I know personally who prayed for a campus at Kittery for a while, that God would do something, that he would work in the schools, that he would work in the community, and not that there was no other work, but that another lighthouse basically would be set up there in addition to the other churches that are working hard for his kingdom. So it's cool to think that people have been praying for us to be established there, and we have been established there. I think that's a really cool thing. One of the lines I loved in the first chapter, page 15, was when he was invited. Jim Cymbala was invited to help shepherd 2 different churches, one in New Jersey and one in Brooklyn. He says, now instead of being an amateur in one congregation, I could double my pleasure. And it's meant to be a joke, but I wrote a line down. It says, we are not professionals. And a pastor wrote a book years ago about pastors and just kind of reminded folks, this is not just a job. This is not here's my career. This is like, we're all shepherds being shepherded by the great shepherd. We're also sheep while we're trying to help the sheep. So pastors and leaders are not professional Christians. We're all Christians trying to pursue Jesus together. I think the thing I would like to emphasize the most, just as food for thought, from these first handful of pages and really coming up to the end of chapter 1 is this. Jim Cymbala reached a point in his church where he was like, if God doesn't show up, what's going to happen? I'd like to think about that in relation to the church and then also us individually. So the first thing I would ask is, do we believe that if God doesn't show up, we can actually continue doing the work that we do at Kittery Point? Do we believe that we really need to pray? And that's like a deep heart level question, because I think sometimes we could say theoretically, oh yeah, I totally believe that, if God wasn't there, what will we do? But then when it comes to the actual application, like, okay, living that out, do we pray like God has to show up for things to happen, or do we just kind of do our own thing and maybe God will do some things as well? People talk about, like, I set people who lay out their plans and they say, God bless this, as opposed to trying to walk in step with what God's plans are. So really at a heart level, I just encourage you to think about, how much do you really truly believe that we need to pray and continue to ask God to be working in our Kittery church community in order to have an impact? The other thing I would ask you is just for yourself individually. Are there areas in your life where you're thinking to yourself, if God doesn't show up, I don't know what's going to happen? I love what he says a couple of pages after 15 pages in, maybe 20 pages in. He just says that God is attracted to weakness when we reach these points of frailty and desperation, that he meets us in those. I don't know about you, but I have situations, people that I know and care about, congregants, different people that I'm engaged with who are in desperate situations. And if God doesn't show up, I don't know how it's going to all come together. It really feels like on an earthly level, like a terrible place to be like, I'm so desperate. I'm totally desperate. And yet in God's mind, it's a good place to be. And we want God to show up immediately and in the way we want him to, and he doesn't always. So for Jim Cymbala, he got to the point of saying, like, God, you have to do something. This whole thing is going to fall apart if you don't do something. And I bet that a lot of us feel that about things going on in our own lives or people that we care about. If you don't show up, God, something, like, what's going to happen? What is going to happen? And I would encourage us just to think about, where do we need to pray that way? And then the other side is that will we give God glory when he shows up in big ways? Will we point people back to him and say, this happened and God came through, and it's God who came through. It wasn't me figuring it out. It wasn't all the details. God came through and just transformed things. So I just would start by, as we get into this book, just encourage us, look around and say, what are those situations that you might think are beyond hope, or you don't even know if they're worth praying about anymore, and press into those and say, God, do something. And then ask God to give you eyes. Pastor Bruce said this on Sunday, that he would open our eyes so we could actually see what he's doing. We could actually see the work around us and how he's answering our prayers in different ways. So there's some food for thought. Feel free to talk about this with other people, have a discussion. And again, not this Wednesday, which is I think it's the 5th, right? 3rd, 4th, 5th. Yeah. Not the 5th, that's our first impressions training, but on the 12th is our first of the discussion group, 6:30 to 8 over at the Kittery Point campus, all right? Keep reading, enjoy the book, feel free to leave comments here or on the Facebook page, other things like that. All right, take care, everybody.